What if I told you the God you've been taught to worship was once known by 1,000 names? Not because he was many gods, but because he was broken, scattered, fragmented on purpose, split across tongues, tribes, and temples, till the memory of the original was no longer whole. This isn't just mythology, this is a spiritual crime scene. The evidence is buried in the soil of every ancient civilization, and in the spiritual DNA of every people who once called the divine by a name that had nothing to do with Yahweh. You feel it, don't you? That nagging sensation that the God in the book, the one who demands loyalty through fear, doesn't sound like the one your soul remembers. You were told he was singular, supreme, but before he was repackaged and rebranded, he was known to the black world as unity and multiplicity. The one who could be many without losing himself. The one who could appear as a mother, a father, a serpent, a tree, a drumbeat, and a constellation, a silence, and still be God. This was not polytheism, it was spiritual depth. This was not confusion, it was divine complexity. And long before colonizers edited the holy books, before the whitewashing of sacred names, before the global erasure of African spiritual systems, this black God was not only present, he was central. He walked with the Nubians, wept with the Cometians, breathed with the Dogon, and thundered with the Zulu. He wore the face of every people who saw themselves as divine. But over time, something shifted, not in the God, but in the world's willingness to see him whole. They began to break him apart, piece by piece, name by name. To conquer the people, they had to conquer their God. So they splintered his essence, renamed his forms, demonized his faces. What was once one became many, and the many were called false gods, idols, demons, blasphemies. His feminine side was called lust. His serpent form was called evil. His black skin was called sin. And the colonizers smiled, because once they fractured the face of God, they fractured the spirit of the people. Now you may be wondering, how could something this divine be hidden for so long? The truth is, it was never fully hidden. It was encoded, preserved in rhythms, dances, names whispered into babies' ears, patterns woven into fabric, rituals passed through breath and bone. He is still here, but under names they taught us to forget. This black god was called Atum by the Cometians, Olodumare by the Yoruba, Nkulukulu by the Zulu, Amun-Ra by the priests of Thebes. He was and still is the same essence, not a different God for each people, but the same eternal being, honored in different mirrors. The lie was in convincing us that those mirrors were broken, that the only real God was the one who arrived by boat and Bible, that the rest were shadows, sorceries, primitive dreams. But dreams hold power when they echo truth. And now, those dreams are waking. You are remembering because the memory was never dead, only buried, and the soil is shifting. So let me tell you the story they didn't want you to hear. The story of the original, the black god who was split into many names, but who has never stopped trying to make himself whole again. Through us, and it begins in the place they tried hardest to erase, Africa, the womb of the world, the cradle of the divine, the land where God first had a face. In the beginning there was no Bible, no Torah, no Quran, no scroll to declare what was sacred and what was sin. There was rhythm. there was breath. There was the land, and in the land, the people felt the pulse of the divine not in fear, but in familiarity, not above them, but within them. They didn't look to the heavens to find God. They looked into rivers, into fire, into their own skin, because they knew the source wore their reflection. The earliest names of God were not spoken in Hebrew. They were chanted in the tongues of the Nile Valley, of the Congo Basin, of the ancient Sahel, where the sun painted men and women black with power. Before I am was ever whispered on Mount Sinai, there was NTR, the Comedian word for the divine principle, the life force behind all things. It wasn't gendered, it wasn't separate, it wasn't angry, it was balance, it was breath, it was being itself. They saw God as male and female, dark and light, and as Ra in the noon sun, as Auset in the midnight healing. They didn't just worship gods, they embodied them. To speak the name of Ausar was to awaken resurrection within. To honor Mayat was to realign with truth. These were not characters in a mythology. These were archetypes of the soul. But the conquerors couldn't rule people who knew they were divine, so they rewrote the stories. Ra became a legend, Auset became a myth, the serpent became Satan, and the names of power were scattered like ashes over stolen lands. They invaded with scripture in one hand and shackles in the other, and told the children of the sun that their gods were demons, that their rituals were witchcraft, that their ancestors were lost. And those children began to forget, not because they were weak, but because forgetting was survival. But some things cannot be unrooted. A name once spoken into the bones of a people does not die easily, and even when the tongue forgets, the blood remembers. So the names lived. In lullabies, in rhythms, in the sway of hips in mourning and celebration, in the way black hands move when they pray, not up to heaven, but to the earth, to the ancestors, to the memory of the God who lived in everything. The black God was everywhere, but he was slowly turned into 1,000 others, turned into Damballa, then called a devil, turned into Ogun, then called a curse, turned into Legba, then called a trickster, turned into Shango, then cast into shadow. But this was never many gods. This was one God split, not in essence, but in narrative, shattered by colonial hands, who feared what he looked like, when he looked like us, and yet the names still carry power, because every name is a piece of the original, a fragment of divinity waiting to be remembered. And as each name is spoken again, the pieces move. The God begins to gather himself. He does not need temples. He needs memory. He needs recognition. He needs breath. And now that you're here, you can feel it, can't you? The vibration under your skin, the drumbeat in your chest, the question you were never allowed to ask, what if the God I've been searching for has been speaking to me in voices my religion told me to ignore? That question is not blasphemy. It's initiation, and the further we go, the more pieces we'll find. Because when the names return, so does the power. They called him El in Canaan. They called him Enki in Sumer. They called him Amma in Mali, but the priesthoods of conquest called them all false. False because they didn't fit the narrative. False because they weren't white. False because they didn't kneel to the coming empire. And so they stripped the names from the land, buried the altars beneath stone churches, and told the world there was only one God. but made sure he didn't look like you. But here's what they won't tell you. The original name of God wasn't erased, it was broken. Broken like a mirror so that each shard could be misread. The name was never meant to be singular, it was meant to be sung. Sung by different tongues in different lands, each note a frequency of the same divine chord. But conquest hates harmony. So they silenced the music and they turned the melody into a monotone. And that monotone spoke only one language, wore only one face, and demanded only one kind of worship: obedience without memory. But we were not made to obey. We were made to remember, to reclaim, to restore. Because the Black God was never a relic. He is a rhythm, a vibration, a force moving through history under new masks, waiting for those with eyes to see past the disguise. He moved through Moses, raised in Egypt. He moved through Yeshua, hiding in Africa. He moved through the maroon prophets, the enslaved priests who prayed in codes. He moved through the blues, the drums, the field hollers. He has always moved through us. They taught us to forget his African names, but not the way our bodies swayed when we spoke them. They made us ashamed of our own sounds, but not the way our souls lit up when we chanted them. They stole the books, but not the breath, because breath is scripture too. And breath remembers. This is why our people still moan in churches, still wail in silence, still call out to a God they cannot name, but feel in their bones. Because even when you erase a name, you cannot erase a frequency, and his frequency has never stopped humming. Each name they buried is now rising, not to form a new religion, but to form a memory map, a way back to the wholeness they stole, not for the sake of doctrine, but for the sake of dignity. Because until the Black God is remembered, the Black soul remains divided. And maybe that's why you're here. Maybe that's why your spirit clicked this video, not for new information, but for old recognition, for the ancient spark that lights the way home. Because we are not just remembering him. He is remembering himself through us, every chant, every dream, every whisper of "I know there's more." He hears it, and with every sound the broken mirror begins to mend. So speak his names with no fear, because the power is not in one of them, it's in all of them together, and we are just beginning to gather the pieces. The first lie they told was that God was far away, that you had to climb a mountain, confess to a priest, or die to finally see him. But the Black God, he walked in gardens barefoot, he whispered in the winds, he danced in the fire. He didn't hide behind veils. He was the veil, the breath between every heartbeat. The moment you looked inward, he was there. Not as a judge, but as your own reflection, waiting to be recognized. This is why ancient African temples weren't made to imprison worship. They were designed to echo. Every wall, every pillar carved with symbols to mirror the heavens. They didn't build to keep God in. They built to remind the people that God was already within. So when you entered, you didn't come as a sinner. You came as a piece of the divine, returning to the house of mirrors to remember your shape. But what happens when a people forget their shape? When you teach them their drums are dangerous, their dances demonic, their ancestors damned. They stop looking inward, they start looking upward, to a sky god who looks nothing like them, and a book that tells them their past was cursed. This was the second lie, that the ancestors were to be feared, that their wisdom was witchcraft, that their presence was possession. But every African spiritual system knew the opposite. The ancestors weren't dead, they were promoted. They were bridges, guardians, messengers. They were the breath of the black god made intimate. And to call their names was to open the door between worlds. You see, in the old ways, memory was sacred. Names were not just sounds, they were codes. When you named your child, you called a piece of the black god into form. You summoned legacy. You invoked protection. And when the people gathered to name the newborn, they weren't picking favorites. They were listening to what name the soul already carried from beyond the veil. That's the power they feared, the kind of power that cannot be taxed or tamed. So they renamed us, stripped our syllables, branded us with sounds that carried no memory, no frequency, no divine link. And for generations we spoke in the tongues of our erasers. But even then, the black god did not forget. He found us in dreams, in chants, in the silent prayers we didn't know we were praying. He showed up as déjà vu, as goosebumps, as the pull you felt the first time you heard the name Olodumare and didn't know why your chest tightened. Because your body knows, your spirit knows, and it's your mind that's been trained to forget. But forgetting is not the end. It is only the fall, and every fall contains the blueprint of a rise. So we rise by remembering, not just who we are, but who he was. Before the split, before the renaming, before the empire turned spirit into property. And when we remember his wholeness, we begin to remember ours. That's the path, not just worship, but remembering, putting the members of the black god back together, piece by sacred piece. They say history is written by the victors, but what if spirituality was edited by the conquerors? What if the sacred books weren't just inspired, they were curated? Pages chosen, verses trimmed, gods erased. And the black god, once central to the soul of the world, was scattered across chapters that never made it to the final draft. This is not speculation, it's historical fact. Whole texts were removed from the canon, the Book of Enoch, gone. The Gospel of Thomas buried. The Wisdom of Solomon in its full depth censored. Why? Because they spoke of divine beings walking among men, of power that did not require a pulpit, of light that lived within. The black god lived in those texts, not as a myth, but as memory, as vibration, as the original spark they couldn't kill, so they hid it under translations, under doctrines, under the threat of heresy. But even in exile, his name survived. It whispered from the catacombs. It echoed from the deserts. It was smuggled in symbols carved into the stone walls of Ethiopian churches. It was sung in secret by griots who turned history into melody. It survived on the breath of mothers who anointed their children with oil, and names they were forbidden to speak aloud, because deep in the silence they forced on us, the black god was humming. He was not waiting to be rediscovered. He was waiting to be heard. And now, in this age of digital echoes and global remembering, the silence is breaking. You can hear him in the rhythm of truth returning. The way lost histories are being pieced together, the way African cosmologies are resurfacing in every conversation, the way the youth are asking questions no priest can answer, because the lie is crumbling. And underneath that lie, we find a God who was never bound to a throne or a tabernacle. He sat in the circle, he moved through the fire, he lived in the stories around the firelight. He was not a God of fear, but of presence. The third lie you see was that God needed to be feared. That trembling meant holiness, that guilt was sacred. But the black God, he was joy, he was rhythm, he was the laughter of the ancestors in the face of empire. He was the drumbeat they tried to outlaw because it summoned memory. So when they told you to fear your roots, to bow your head and shrink your spirit, they weren't saving your soul. They were severing your connection, because a connected soul is a free soul. And a free soul does not kneel to empire. But freedom always finds a way. And now that you've begun to remember, the chain of forgetting has cracked. The exile is ending. And the black God, fragmented, renamed, misrepresented, is gathering himself through your awakening. He was never lost, only waiting. And every truth you reclaim and every name you speak is one step closer to wholeness, one piece of the puzzle returning to place. The story is being reassembled, not on paper but in you. If God was once whole and is now fractured across names, languages, and legends, then our journey is not to convert, but to recover. Not to choose which name is correct, but to ask why they were torn apart to begin with. Because a people who know their God cannot be ruled, and a God who looks like the people cannot be used as a weapon against them. That is why the black God was dismembered, not just spiritually but politically. He was too powerful to be left intact. He unified too much, stood for too much, carried too much ancestral fire in his bones, so they splintered him, took his motherly aspects and called them fertility cults, took his serpent wisdom and called it evil, took his animal forms and called them primitive, took his skin and made sure his new image wore theirs. You see, the whitewashing of the divine was not a mistake. It was a strategy, a slow, deliberate conversion of divinity from something reflected in you to something imposed upon you. So by the time they painted the face of Jesus, he didn't look like the carpenter from Nazareth. He looked like a European king, pale, soft, unscarred. But the land Jesus came from burned brown under the sun, and the teachings he carried were echoes of older African truths. And if Jesus spoke in parables, then maybe some of those parables were fragments of a forgotten whole, pieces of the black God, hidden beneath the language of empire. What if the kingdom of heaven is within you wasn't just metaphor, but resistance? What if it was a secret code telling you that you didn't need a church or a chain to access the divine? They couldn't allow that, so they removed the texts that pointed inward, buried the books that honored the feminine, silenced the stories that traced divinity back to the Nile, to the Congo, to the Sahel, to the land where the gods wore dreadlocks and black skin. But stories don't die. They wait. They wait in the breath of the griot. They wait in the bones of the dancer. They wait in the child who dreams of a temple she's never seen, but knows by heart. And when enough people start to remember, those fragments begin to shine again. You start seeing connections you were never taught, like how Ozar's resurrection predates Christ, how Ma'at's feather of judgment mirrors Revelation's final scale, how the trinity of Ausar, Auset, and Heru was rewritten, rebranded, repackaged. The gods were not many. They were masks, and the black god wore them all. not to confuse them, but to reveal. Each form was a lesson. Each name was a vibration. Each story a mirror, until the empire broke the mirrors and taught us to look at only one. But one cannot hold the infinite. And now the infinite is cracking through the lie. Now you see it, don't you? The thread that ties them all together. The truth they feared you would find. The fragments are not foreign, they are familiar. They are yours, and it's time to bring them home. There was a time when to know the names of God was to know yourself, because God was not distant or abstract. God was ancestry. God was lineage. God was the rhythm of blood through generations, the voice of those who walked before you, echoing through your own becoming. And so the names of God were not just invocation. They were inheritances. You didn't worship a God outside you. You honored the God within you, the God who looked like your mother, who spoke in your father's tone, who danced through your people's grief and celebration. But when conquest came, they told you that such knowing was pride, that such memory was dangerous, that God could not possibly look like you and still be holy. They replaced intimacy with hierarchy, turned the sacred into ceremony, the breath into bureaucracy. They drew borders where there had only been bridges, and they built temples to tell you that God was in one place only, and it was not in your skin. But the temples of the black God were never limited to buildings. They were forests, caves, mountains, groves of sacred trees. They were circles of elders, speaking wisdom under moonlight. They were women grinding grain and singing stories into it. They were men marking the stars to read the destiny of nations. And each temple carried a name, a fragment, a face, a remembrance. The Yoruba called him Olodumare, the unknowable, the source of all things, not to shrink him, but to honor how vast he was. They knew he didn't need to be caged in human categories. He could be male and female, form and formless, fire and water, silence and sound. But empires don't like ambiguity. They want gods who command, gods who bless conquest, gods who authorize domination. So they simplified the divine, flattened it, gave it laws but no laughter, judgment but no joy. And in doing so, they silenced the names that carried the full emotional palette of God. Names like Nyame of the Akan, who sits above but sees within. Like Chineke of the Igbo, who births creation through voice. Like Ngai of the Kikuyu, who dwells atop mountains and moves with the rain. All these names were once said in awe, but now sit buried under colonial rubble. Not because they failed, but because they threatened. Because they didn't require permission to be powerful. Because they placed holiness back in your hands, but those hands still remember. And when they rise, to write, to drum, to anoint, to resist, the fragments begin to glow again, like coals beneath centuries of ash. You are not searching for a new God. You are excavating an old one who has waited for your return, not with wrath, but with welcome. And as you speak his names, the ones they said were forgotten, you're not just honoring the past, you're rebuilding the bridge back to a wholeness that was never lost, only hidden, and only for a time. In every empire, the first war is spiritual, not with swords, but with stories, not with armies, but with names. And in the conquest of the African spirit, the most dangerous weapon was erasure, not of bodies but of memory, because once you make a people forget who their God was, you make them forget who they are. And so the black god was not simply demonized, he was replaced, rebranded, made to wear the face of the colonizer, the theology of the enslaver, the cold distance of a sky father who required intermediaries to speak. But the black god never asked for distance. He didn't wait behind veils or clouds. He lived in the market, the forest, the womb, the whisper between mother and child. And when you spoke to him, you didn't beg, you remembered. You didn't kneel, you aligned. Because worship was not about submission, it was about connection. This is what they tried to sever: the sacred intimacy, the unbroken thread between the divine and the daily. So they rewrote the books, removed the matriarchs, replaced the sacred feminine with silence, and told you that the black goddess was a seductress, not a source of creation. But the old stories still speak, and if you listen carefully, they are returning. In the fire rituals of the Dagara, in the Ifa divinations of the Yoruba, in the cosmograms of the Congo, you will find echoes of a god who was whole, multi-faced and rooted in rhythm. This god was not threatened by dance, he was the dance. Not disturbed by grief, he was the tears. Not distant from death, he walked with the ancestors, and they feared that kind of god. Because he could not be tamed by doctrine, he lived in the bodies, in the sweat, in the dream, and so they built walls. Not to protect you, but to protect themselves from the god that knew you too well. You see, the real danger was not that the black god was false. The real danger was that he was free. Free from their systems, free from their control. And if you knew that God, you would never kneel to empire again. That's why the erasure was violent, not just in text, but in tongue. They beat our languages out of us, burned our symbols, outlawed our ceremonies, all to cut the cord between our soul and our source. But cords that are divine cannot be fully severed. They retract into silence, but they pulse. And now, that pulse is rising. You feel it when your spirit stirs without knowing why. When an old song touches something in you that has no name but every truth, when the dream repeats and the symbols come back. These are not coincidences, they are callings. The black god is calling his names back to himself through you, through your memory, your questions, your longing to know what the world told you to forget. And as you answer, you rebuild the temple that empire tried to burn, not out there, but inside you. Stone by sacred stone. There's a reason they told you not to look back. Because back there, buried under ash and empire, is a truth more powerful than any pulpit can contain. Back there is the original image, the first face of the divine, and that face was black. Not just in skin, but in soul, in rhythm, in memory, in the way it held paradox without fear. The black god was not either or. He was, and he was the storm and the silence, the seed and the sun, the darkness that birthed light. But they feared the darkness, so they demonized it. They said light was holy, so long as it was white. They painted angels with golden curls and called blackness a stain. But in the oldest stories, darkness was not sin, it was the womb. the sacred space of becoming. So when they erased the black god, they weren't just removing a deity. They were removing your right to see yourself as divine, because once you believe that God doesn't look like you, you'll forever bow to those who claim he looks like them. This is why the image matters, not for vanity, but for validation, because image shapes identity. And if every painting, every sculpture, and every children's Bible shows a God who looks nothing like your people, then even your subconscious learns to see holiness as foreign. But the truth is this: the black god was never just a god among others. He was the original template, the prototype from which all later theologies borrowed. Amun-Ra, whose breath created the universe. Ptah, who spoke the world into being. Ausar, who died and rose long before the name Jesus was whispered. These weren't just myths. They were memories, coded, preserved, and passed on through spirit. And across the continent, other names carried the same spark. Obatala, the sculptor of human form. Chukwu, the source of all energies. Nomo, the divine twins of the Dogon, who came from the stars and spoke truth in water. Each of these names carried a frequency dash, and together they formed a map, a way back to wholeness, not just for God, but for you. Because when God is split, so is the soul. And when you pray to a deity who looks like your oppressor, you inherit chain, invisible but heavy. But when you return to the face of the black god, you inherit wings. Wings that remember how to dance in ceremony, how to chant without shame, how to walk knowing that the ground beneath you is sacred. Because you are sacred. This is not about rejecting other faiths. It's about remembering the root beneath them, the source they came from. And that source was not a man in the sky. It was the breath of the ancestors, the rhythm of the land, the fire in your blood, and it's still here, waiting for you to speak its names again, not for worship, but for reconnection. Not to beg, but to become. Because the more names you remember, the more whole you become, and the more whole he becomes through you. So what happens? When the broken pieces start to remember they were once one, when the names scattered across continents and centuries begin to hum in unison again. What happens when Ausar, Obatala, Amun, Chukwu, Nzambi, Nomo, and Ra are no longer seen as separate deities, but as faces of the same divine intelligence, fractured by history, not by truth? You begin to see it, don't you? That the war was never about who had the real God. It was about making you forget that you always did. Because a fractured God creates fractured people. And fractured people are easy to manipulate, easy to divide, easy to shame. But a people who remember the original face of God, who see the divine as an echo of themselves, become ungovernable, not lawless, but deeply rooted, guided not by fear, but by ancestral fire. This is what they feared, a revival not of religion, but of remembrance, of divine memory waking up in black skin and saying, I am not a stranger to the sacred. I am the sacred. Because once you understand that the Creator was not introduced to you by missionaries, but reborn in your image, you stop looking for validation. You stop asking for permission. You realize that your people did not start with slavery, they started with sovereignty. And in that sovereignty, the divine danced. She wore braids. He played drums. They gathered under stars and passed wisdom through rhythm. The temples were not just stone. They were stories, etched into skin, braided into hair, spoken in tongues the West still can't decipher. And yet, those same tongues are rising again. You hear it in the chants of elders, the sudden urge to learn your language, the dreams that feel older than your lifetime. You see, this is not nostalgia, it's prophecy. Because the black god never died, he just hid. In plain sight, inside you, inside the child who questions the white Jesus on the wall, inside the grandmother who prays in secret to a name older than church, inside the pulse you feel when the drum hits just right and your body starts to move without permission. That's him. That's her. That's them, returning to you through your own remembering, not through conquest, but through coherence, when the fragments begin to harmonize again, not as rivals, but as reflection. And that harmony, that's the sound of a God coming back together, not in heaven, but in you. So speak the names, all of them. Speak them with reverence, not rivalry. Let them live again in your bone, because each one is a key, and you, beloved, are the lock they've been waiting to open. The deeper you go, the more you realize this was never just about religion. It was about identity theft on a cosmic scale, because when you erase a people's God, you erase their mirror. And when the mirror is gone, they don't just forget what divinity looks like. They forget what they look like beneath the masks they were forced to wear. This is why they replaced your gods with theirs, not to save your soul, but to own your mind. Because if you worship what they give you, you'll serve what they build, you'll defend what they profit from, you'll protect the very system that depends on your amnesia. And so the black god was not just buried, he was weaponized, stripped of his royalty, turned into caricature, made either devil or savage, never sacred, never sovereign. But the stories still survive, in whispers, in rhythm, in rebellion. Every time you questioned why your God had blue eyes and hair like wheat, but somehow ruled over a land of melanin and drums, that was the black god waking up inside you. Every time you stared at a statue and felt nothing, but walked into nature and felt everything, that was the black god calling you home. Home was never a location, it was alignment, a resonance between your soul and your source. And the closer you get to it, the louder the names become. You start dreaming of symbols you've never seen. You hear chants in languages you've never learned. You feel pulled toward practices your ancestors were punished for. This isn't New Age. This is ancient memory. It's your DNA singing. It's the drumbeat of your lineage, finally breaking through the noise. And when it does, you don't just remember names. You remember role. You were not born merely to survive. You were born to carry a piece of the divine that only you could express. Some of you are griots, keepers of the word. Others are healers, touching pain until it turns to power. Some are seers, walking between veils and returning with vision. And some are architects of temples the world has yet to see. But all of you are part of the reconstruction, because the black god was not destroyed and he was distributed, and each of you carries a piece. And when you awaken to that, when you realize that you were never broken, only buried, The empire shakes because it cannot enslave a people who have remembered their divinity. So let the pieces find each other. Let the names return to your mouth. Let the rhythm return to your feet. Let the fire return to your voice. Because the Black God is not just coming. The Black God is assembling in you right now. So now the question is, what happens when the scattered pieces of the divine start calling each other home? When the names of the Black God, whispered in isolation for centuries, finally begin to echo together, like a cosmic choir reunite, the answer is simple. The world starts to tremble, not because of violence, but because of vibration. The frequency of remembrance is the most dangerous sound to systems built on forgetting, because when the Black God returns, he doesn't come through conquest. He comes through clarity. And nothing terrifies empire more than a people who see clearly, who remember fully, who love themselves divinely. And that's the revolution. Not burning cities, but building temples within your own spirit, not screaming to be heard, but sitting so still that the ancestors speak again. And what do they say? They say you were never slaves, you were never lost, you were hidden, protected in plain sight until the time was right to rise again. And that time, it's now. It's now because the lies are collapsing and because the gods they gave you no longer speak to your bones. Because the rituals that once felt foreign now feel like coming home. You light candles and something awakens. You drum and the ancestors arrive. You close your eyes and visions return that no sermon ever explained. You were not hallucinating. You were hearing what they feared you'd hear. Your original instructions, the codes they buried in your blood. The truth encrypted in your melanin, the map tattooed on your soul, long before colonization carved borders. And what's that map pointing to? Wholeness, the reunion of the God who was split and the soul that was silenced. Each act of remembrance is a repair. Each word spoken in your ancestral tongue is a stitch in the torn fabric of your divinity. And as more of you remember, as more of you reawaken, the veil thins. You stop needing permission. You stop asking, am I allowed? And instead you declare, I am the permission. I am the inheritance. I am the return. Because you were never meant to serve a god you could not see yourself in. You were meant to become the vessel through which the divine re-entered the world, not as myth, but as movement, not as doctrine, but as embodiment. So stand in that, speak from that, live from that, because the Black God was not just meant to be worshipped, he was meant to be mirrored. Through your life, through your light, through the names you remember and the truths you refuse to forget. And now you begin to feel it, don't you? The shift, the subtle reordering of your soul, like something ancient is moving inside you, not forward, not backward, but inward, calling you to a truth that no book, no priest, no colonizer could ever own, because truth was never meant to be owned. It was meant to be embodied. And the Black God, he didn't give commandments, he gave codes woven into rhythm, etched into earth, passed from breath to breath in the pulse of your people. This is what they tried to sever, not just culture, but continuity. Because if you forget the rhythm, you forget how to move. If you forget the names, you forget who you're speaking to. And if you forget who you're speaking to, You forget who you are, but here you are, remembering again, not through textbooks, but through activation, through the fire in your belly. When you hear the old names pronounced without shame, through the tears that fall when you realize you are not alone in this awakening. And that's the miracle. You were never alone. You were surrounded by those who carried the names in secret, those who prayed when praying to your God was a death sentence, those who danced barefoot in the soil so their children would remember what it felt like to be free. Their blood runs in you. Their memory is your memory. You don't need permission to reclaim it. You just need willingness. Willingness to feel, to listen, to stop pretending that your intuition is superstition, to stop apologizing for seeing what others refuse to see. Because seeing is sacred. It's how the divine re-enters the world. Through your eyes, through your choices, through the way you love your skin, your people, your ancestors, and your God, especially when he doesn't fit the image they tried to sell you. You're not buying it anymore. The whitewashed divinity, the edited history, the lie that says you must go through another to reach the source, when the source has always been in you. That's why they split him, to scatter your sense of wholeness. But now the pieces are moving, aligning, locking into place like stars returning to original orbit. And you are the axis. You are the center of the return, not as ego, but as essence, as the living altar, where the black god is no longer just remembered, but reborn. This is no longer theory. This is no longer myth. This is remembrance in its rawest form, a fire rising through your spine that says, I knew this before I could speak it, because deep down, beneath the programming and the pews, you always felt it. That the divine didn't come from the sky. The divine rose from the earth. And the earth looked like you. And that's the blasphemy they feared. A black god who didn't need saving. A black people who didn't need permission. A sacred lineage that didn't need to be fixed, only remembered. So they broke the mirror. They silenced the drums. They outlawed the chants. They stripped the names, then called you savage for forgetting what they stole. But the soul is not so easily erased. You can burn a scroll, but you can't burn a soul. And your soul has kept score. It has guarded the truth, like a priest guards prophecy. And now it is time. Time to pick up the pieces. Time to weave the names back together into a tapestry of wholeness, not just for history, but for destiny. Because this isn't just about reclaiming the past, it's about rebuilding the future from a foundation of truth. And the truth is this: the black god never left. He was fractured, buried under shame, translated into silence, but never extinguished. You see him when you look in the mirror and feel more than flesh. You hear her when you speak the names, and something ancient hums in your chest. You feel them when you walk barefoot on the land, and the land speaks back. This is not poetic. This is prophetic, because prophecy has always been encoded in your very being. And the moment you stop outsourcing your holiness to systems that profit from your confusion, you begin to resurrect the sacred, not just in temple, but in your daily breath, in the way you feed yourself, in the way you love your people, in the way you protect your peace, as if your peace is a portal, because it is. Every act of self-love is an act of spiritual rebellion. Every memory of your God self is a weapon against the systems that taught you to bow to your own erasure. But now you rise, not as a god to be worshipped, but as a mirror to remind others. They've been divine all along. This is how the Black God returned. Not in thunder, but in you, quietly, fully, unapologetically whole. And so it begins. Not with lightning, not with scripture, but with you. Breathing differently, walking differently, remembering different. Not because someone told you to, but because the rhythm within you can no longer be silenced. You feel it in your chest, don't you? And that pounding is not your heartbeat. It's a drum. The first drum, the one that called the gods to earth. Long before pyramids, long before prophets, long before pages were written, to contain what was never meant to be contained. Because divinity was never about control, it was about connection. And you were always connected, but connection is dangerous to those who depend on your disconnection to survive. So they convinced you that God was far away, that you were born in sin, that your skin was cursed, that your wisdom was witchcraft. They lied. They lied because the truth would have broken every chain. The truth that your skin is sacred, that your roots reach back to the stars, that your body is not a burden. It is a temple built in the image of gods who looked like you. The Black God was never just one. He was many, fractals of the divine, woven into tribes, tongues, rituals, and rhythms, a symphony of selves, each holding a key to the greater whole. That's why they renamed him, split him, scattered him across continents and centuries, because as long as the names were broken, you would be broken. But you're not broken anymore. You're remembering the melody, the original frequency, the sound of God, when spoken in the language of your ancestors, and with every name you reclaim. Obatala, Ausar, Dambala, Enkai, Nyame. The pieces begin to glow, not as relics, but as reminders that the divine never left. It just waited, in silence, in shadow, in you, and now you walk differently, because you no longer carry just memory. You carry presence. You carry power, the kind of power that doesn't need titles, doesn't need temples, just truth, just breathe, just you. Awake, aligned, and unapologetically divine, because the God they split has become the God who returned, fully formed, fully felt, fully you. But what happened when the return is complete, when the last forgotten name is spoken again with reverence, when the final piece clicks into place within your soul, and the mirror, the true mirror, is no longer cracked? What happens is revolution, not the kind that storms building, but the kind that rebuilds souls. A revolution of recognition, of millions suddenly realizing they were never empty vessels, waiting to be saved. They were temples, waiting to be re-entered by the divine they've carried all along. This is not metaphor, this is remembrance made flesh. Because when you walk into the world, knowing the Black God breathes through you, your decisions change. Your presence shifts the atmosphere. You don't just hope for liberation, you embody it. You don't just seek truth, you become it. And the systems, they panic, because nothing threatens empire like a people who've remembered that their story didn't begin with chains or crosses or conquest. But with creation, you were not born of sin. You were born of intention. You are the consequence of a divine dream too powerful to be erased, too ancient to be rewritten. They tried to rename you, but your soul kept the original password. They tried to relocate your gods, but your blood kept the coordinate. They tried to bury your origins, but the soil itself whispers your birthright every time your feet touch the ground. And now that you know, now that you feel it, you become unstoppable. Not in ego, but in essence. Because this is what it means to be the descendant of a split God. You are not fragments. You are multiplicity. You are the embodiment of a truth so vast, so eternal that it could not be contained in one name, one face, one story. And so the names return. The drumbeat returns. The sacred walk returns. You reclaim your food, your voice, your dreams. You stop explaining your magic to those who fear it. You stop apologizing for your clarity. You stop seeking validation from altars that never recognized you, because now you are the altar, the offering, the flame. And as you stand in that flame, the darkness doesn't swallow you. It fears you, because it knows the black god who was split is no longer a myth waiting for discovery. He is alive, and he walks the earth again. Through you, there's no turning back now. Not after the veil has lifted, not after your soul has tasted what wholeness actually feels like. Because once you've seen the black god, in the mirror of your own spirit, nothing else satisfies. No lie can lull you, no system can seduce you, no cheap imitation of holiness can hold your loyalty anymore. You've outgrown the illusion. And with that growth comes a burden, but also a blessing. Because to remember is to respond, to feel the ancestors rise within your bones, is to move differently, to speak with intention, to walk as if the ground itself has been waiting for your return, because it has. Every tree, every river, every gust of wind knows your name in languages you haven't even remembered yet. And now you start to hear them again, not just voices, but vibrate, the hum of your lineage, the beat of your becoming. The black god, not above you, but within you, guiding every step, rewriting every script. They tried to force you into. And this is where the real healing begins, and not in history books, but in your body. Your cells remembering the sun, your breath syncing with the rhythm of lands you've never touched, but somehow belong to you. You are not reclaiming this alone. You are part of a resurrection. A rising of voices, drums, dances, declarations, a movement of spirits who refuse to be erased again. This isn't rebellion, it's return. And in that return, you stop asking if you're worthy. You stop wondering if you're lost. You start moving like you are the map, because you are. The lost cities are inside you. The ancient songs are sleeping in your breath. The power they feared, it's pulsing in your veins, waiting for you to trust it. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be present, to show up to your truth with all its fire and fragility, because it's not about being flawless. It's about being faithful to the divine spark that refused to go out, no matter how many names they changed, how many gods they erased, how many times they told you. You were never enough. You are more than enough. You are the evidence, You are the return. You are the prophecy unfolded. And now the only question that remains is, what does the world look like? When you walk as if the divine was never taken from you, because it wasn't. It was waiting, and now it's awake in you. So here we are, no longer at the beginning, not quite at the end, but standing in the sacred space where everything converges. The names, the stories, the gods, the ancestors, the lies that broke us, and the truths that stitched us back together. One memory at a time. You've walked through the distortion, through the erasure, through the silence they imposed on your soul. And you kept going, and now the silence is gone, replaced by drums, by names rising from your tongue, with power, with purpose, with permission that you no longer ask for, because you now remember you were the permission you always were. The black god who was split was never waiting to be rescued. He was waiting to be recognized in your breath, in your resistance, in the tears you shed when something ancient stirred. As you whispered names they said were dead. But dead things don't call you home. Dead things don't vibrate in your bones. Dead things don't make your chest burn. With memory you can't explain, and this was never about religion, it was about reclamation. Because to reclaim the black god is to reclaim your own divinity, not to dominate, not to control, but to liberate your from the lies they built into your bloodline, to liberate your children from the chains of invisible shame, to liberate the world from a hierarchy of holiness that said only one God, one name, one people could be sacred. Number, you are sacred. Your names are sacred. Your stories are sacred. Your God, the black God, who is sacred, and he was never lost. He was hidden inside you, behind your trauma, beneath your doubt. And now, with each breath, each truth, each act of remembrance, he returns, not as myth, but as movement, not as symbol, but as source, not as legend, but as life. So say his names, all of them. Say them with reverence, say them with rage, say them with the full weight of your healing voice, because the black god was split so that you would forget, but now you remember, and the world will never be the same.